Okay, we're looking today at Romans 8, 7 through 8. Dioti to phronima te sarkos ekthra is theon. Togar nomo to the upotasita, udha gardunata. Because the mind set on the flesh is hostile toward God, for it is not submitting itself to the law of God, for it is not able, implied, to submit itself to the law of God. The word ekthra can also mean enemy, and the idea here is that the mind of the flesh is an enemy to God. Now, once again, we have to identify the genitive relationship between phronima and sarkos. And just as I've argued before, I understand that Paul has in view an event in phronima, the minding of the flesh, rather than an object or an entity, thing. So I take sarkos to be an objective genitive because of verse 5, where Paul uses the verbal form of phroneo with flesh as the direct object. For those who are according to the flesh are minding, phronousin, the things of the flesh. Ekthra here is a predicate. It is not a predicate adjective, it's a predicate noun. Because it's a noun. And is theon, is here indicates opposition, movement toward, in this case, an attitude toward. So since ekthra is enmity or enemy, it's clearly the one whom the enemy is opposed to. To garnomo, nomo would be, I would take it a dative of reference. I don't think it's an indirect object because there's no direct object here. Indirect objects are things or persons that receive the direct object. So a dative of reference. The verb upotasita is passive, middle passive. I suppose if you take this as middle, so let me back up. If you take this as a middle verb, to submit oneself, then it has an internal direct object of self, and then indirect object of to the law makes sense. If you take it passively, then he is not submitted, he does not submit with reference to the law. So either one. The law of God, God I would take to be the source of the law. This is, you could argue for in a verbal sense for nomo, and nomos, something like to rule, to bear rule, nomeo, and then it would be God's ruler. It would be a subjective genitive, but I don't really think that that's in view. I think it's actually the directions or the commandments of the law that God has given, which he's not submitting to, though that is implicitly not submitting to the rule of God. And dunate is a deponent verb, middle passive in form, active in meaning. It's a present tense. And so I forgot to talk about the tense use of upotasita. Either progressive or gnomic, it's just as a normal fact, a mind set on the flesh is not submitting itself to the law of God. So I'd be fine with gnomic, though I'm also okay with progressive. I don't think that there's any good reason to insist on one or the other. In part because we find a great deal of inconsistency in the mind set on the flesh. So, and dunate, progressive, stative, or gnomic as well. Either one. Any questions about verse 7? Okay, verse 8. Othe en sarkiondes theo arese udunande. So we have an article at the beginning that cooperates with ondes, the ones being, the ones who live or exist in sarki, in the flesh, udunande, are not able to please God. In sarki, it clearly indicates a sphere rather than a location. Ondes is a substantive participle functioning as the subject of dunanda. The sense, the use of the tense, the present tense, it's, there aren't any other options for emi, so the use of the present tense is highly constrained and therefore not that significant, but a progressive stative seems appropriate. The O is in the dative case because arresco requires its direct object in the dative case. So the verb arese takes a dative direct object. Arese is a constative aorist, not able to please God. I don't see anything about the verb itself, the context, or the grammar that would require an alternative use. And dunanda is again progressive stative, or if you want, perhaps gnomic. Those who are in the flesh are not able to please God. I think that's always true, so you could easily argue for a gnomic there. Any questions about that verse?
Could you say is the use of the infinitive?
It's complementary infinitive. Sorry, I didn't complementary. Okay. Now, breaking things up into these two verse chunks is unhandy for seeing the text as a whole, so I'd like to back up and kind of view verses 5 to 8 together. So verse 5, those who are according to the flesh, notice the shift in prepositional phrase. You've got according to the flesh, and then you've got those who are in flesh in these two. Those who are operating, we could say, or existing according to the flesh, are minding, setting their minds on the things of the flesh. Then verses 6 and 7 seem to fill out that explanation. Why is that, or not so much why is that the case, but what that means. What does it mean to mind the things of the flesh? Well, its consequence in verse 6 is death. And the reason for that consequence, so I take verse 7 to further explain why the minding of the flesh is death, is because it sets the person in opposition to God. And God is the source of life. How can there be life for a person who's in opposition to the source of life? Now, I think it's fairly clear from Galatians 5:16 and following, as well as Romans 13:14, that it is possible for a person who is saved, number one, to unconsciously be setting their mind on the things of the flesh, and thereby need to grow in their knowledge. I think it's also possible for them to choose to fulfill the lusts of the flesh, which is another way of saying set their mind on the things of the flesh. What I don't believe is possible is for a saved person to persist in that state, in that choice pattern unrepentantly. Okay? And Paul's going to use the phrase to be in flesh as his preferred way of saying a person who is persisting in a choice pattern of unrepentant setting their mind upon the things of the flesh. Okay? And so while these two ways of thinking, two ways of orienting life are diametrically opposed, there are people who exist in one or the other, and there is the possibility of those who have their minds set on the things that are according to the Spirit may be drawn back this way without existing over here as a way of life. Am I making sense? Any questions?
I guess just that it seems hard to define what constitutes existing in that state versus visiting that state.
Well, there's at least one major criterion, and that is a lack of repentance. So those who are in the flesh are not seeking to be in the Spirit. There is no, they have not turned, they do not turn from it. Okay. The second criteria would be what's going to come up in the next verse, that they don't have the Spirit of Christ dwelling in them. So a person who's been born again, has the Spirit of Christ in them, has repented, who, if they fulfill the desires of the flesh, turns from that, repents, and seeks to make adjustments to their course so they do not again fulfill those desires, gives evidence that they are not living in the flesh.
So you see a parallel framework here with 1 John.
Oh, very much.
Yeah.
Okay.